Do note this video contains discussion on the following: racism, colonialism, head shrinking, slavery, rape and sexual assault, transphobia, and employer abuse. For most people, change is an essential part of life. Not only does it keep things fresh, preventing stagnation, but it's through change that growth occurs, both on an individual and a societal level. So when Disney World Orlando announced plans to update its uniform policy to allow, among other things, gender-inclusive hairstyles, one would be reasonable in expecting a well-adjusted adult to see that for what it is. Disney doing the bare minimum to bring their parks policies in line with the modern day and make more people feel welcome as a means to increase their profit. After all, gender non-conforming people exist, they have money, and a good way for Disney to get that money is for them to make said people feel more welcome in their parks and thus more likely to attend. A way to do that is to no longer exclude them from your workforce. And the same is true for both the changes to piercings and tattoos, with certain ethnic groups giving such practices deep cultural significance. I've always found it interesting yet incredibly disturbing to see how Disney made a splash with its movie Moana in 2016, and yet, as per its rules, many Polynesian people couldn't work at the park because of visible tattoos. In fact, many still won't be able to, since even after the changes, any visible tattoos must be located below the neck and smaller than a person's hand, and Polynesian tattoos located on the face or being larger than the allowed size limit are common. So whilst it's a welcome change that is ultimately a step in the right direction, there's still a question to be had about the way in which Disney exploits the various cultures it discriminates against through employment. Now, this isn't the first time Disney has changed its rules. After the park first opened in 1955, it wasn't until 1994 that women working there could wear eyeshadow and eyeliner. Meanwhile, Disney only allowed men to grow beards in 2012. So these changes seem to be the latest in a long line designed to, as a Disney spokesperson told the Orlando Sentinel, allow them to, quote, remain relevant in today's workplace, end quote. However, not everyone is thrilled. Take, for example, Jonathan VanBoskerck, a 60-year-old parkgoer who is certain that these latest changes to Disney's uniform are evidence that Disney is bending the knee to the woke mob. In a piece titled, "I love Disney World, but wokeness is ruining the experience," published to the very same Orlando Sentinel 10 days after the original article announcing the changes, Jonathan laments over the fact that these changes have apparently destroyed his immersion. He lashes out, asserting that he's paying to experience Disney, not their employees' happiness. Because, as we all know, the happiest place on earth shouldn't include treating your staff like human beings. Jonathan also talks shit about how Disney is apparently on a slippery slope. How, at their current rate, they'll start allowing staff to use their mobile phones whilst performing in stage plays. This is in spite of the fact that, unlike whatever hairstyle they have, having their phones out during a stage play would actually impede their work, meaning the two are not the least bit comparable. It's also interesting to point out that the original article, the one that seemingly provoked this response from Jonathan, contained all the information regarding the previous changes to Disney's uniform, yet Jonathan never once talks about them. So it seems he's perfectly fine with the idea of women wearing eye makeup or men growing beards to express themselves, but the moment Disney allows things that are respectful to both the gender non-conforming and certain cultures, things have gone too far. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that the only thing Jonathan takes issue with are the things that allow for people who don't look like him or his family. Or at least I would be were it not for the rest of Jonathan's article. For you see, as much as Jonathan starts with the changes to Disney's uniform code, I get the feeling that this was mostly an excuse to rant about other changes at Disney World, specifically changes involving the removal of some of Jonathan's favourite characters. Because in spite of the original article only mentioning changes to Disney's uniform and Splash Mountain, which we'll come to in a second, Jonathan leads on from his rant about the uniforms into one about the removal of Trader Sam from the Jungle Cruise ride. Now, there were actually two characters removed from the ride, both of which are being referred to as Trader Sam in the papers, though only one actually is. and that's the African figure who once wore a tribal mask. Then we have his South American cousin, no, I'm not making that up, Chief Nah-Mee, who is depicted as a pot-bellied native wearing a random assortment of European attire. Both figures are holding shrunken heads for sale to Western tourists. Now, putting aside either figure's physical appearance, elements of which are racist enough on their own, we need to talk about the specific colonial history behind the sale of shrunken heads to Europeans. Head shrinking is a very real practice that has been documented in the northwestern region of the Amazon, being practiced by various Jivaroan people that exist along the border of what is now Ecuador and Peru, most notably the Shuar people. Now, contrary to popular portrayal of those who practice head shrinking, the area was actually relatively peaceful, being spared the large-scale conflicts that has defined most of European history. But raids for resources were conducted from time to time, and it was during those raids that the heads of the slain would be taken, their skulls removed, and the fleshy remains shrunk around stones and sand to produce what the locals referred to as sansa, the shrunken heads. Now I need to be clear, the heads were not the reason for the raids, there was no such thing as head hunting. The sansa were an afterthought. The Shuar believed the heads had the power to protect the tribe, specifically from the spirit of the head's original owner, acting as a spiritual ward, assurance against ghostly retribution. Fast forward to the late 19th century, and colonial tourists saw these shrunken heads and decided that they needed to get their hands on them as souvenirs. So, they began to trade with the Jivaroan people, with many offering guns for the shrunken heads. This completely destabilized the once peaceful region, creating a power vacuum to see who could obtain the most heads and, through them, the most firearms. Thus, the practice of head hunting, that is, the practice of hunting down mostly indigenous people solely for the purpose of taking heads, was born. By white people. Head hunting is a white atrocity. At this point, the sansa had lost its religious and cultural significance. Head shrinking was no longer about protecting oneself from retribution, it was about obtaining modern weapons. And as more heads made it back to Europe and the US and were shown at parties as conversation pieces, demand grew, more guns were traded, making the killing more efficient. And this continued well into the 20th century. In fact, The Times, a mainstream British newspaper, ran ads selling what were thought to be genuine shrunken heads as late as 1952. That was after the birth of my grandfather. So this isn't ancient history, this is within living memory. And yet, in spite of being the leading cause of violence in the region, white buyers acted as if they were doing something noble, that they were merely preserving evidence of the savagery of the lesser races. And it's that white narrative that Trader Sam embodies, a narrative that was, and in many ways still is, used to justify further colonial violence around the world. It's shit like this that acts as the foundation for the lie in which we, white people, save native people from their supposedly savage ways, all whilst kicking the facts that we are directly responsible for what happened under the rug. And that's why, in spite of the practice of head shrinking never having been recorded in Africa, Trader Sam is still depicted as taking part in said practice, because it's a shorthand intended to justify colonial oppression by demonizing all native and non-white people. So, it is of perhaps little surprise, though certainly long overdue, that Disney announced Sam and Chief Nah-Mee's removal as an attempt at, quote, addressing negative depictions of natives in the attraction, end quote. Yet, perhaps not shockingly, Jonathan refuses to acknowledge the truth of how harmful this depiction of natives is in propagating colonial myths, downplaying the issue as being, quote, Trader Sam is out because he might offend certain people, end quote. Except, there's no might about it. Disney is not going to go out of its way to change elements of its park without good financial incentive. After all, the dollar is God to the Disney enterprise. That hasn't changed. It's not a coincidence that Disney removed racist depictions from their Jungle Cruise ride mere months before the scheduled release of their movie named after the ride, something that brings with it renewed interest and scrutiny. They removed said depictions not because they were racist, but because that racism threatened to hurt their bottom line by turning away Black and South American people. Because as much as Jonathan bemoans the fact that, quote, "The next time I ride the Jungle Cruise, I will not be thinking about the gloriously entertaining puns of the skippers, I will be thinking about Disney's political agenda, that's a mood killer," end quote, he never stops once to consider how much of a mood killer it must be for someone of African or South American descent to constantly see racist depictions like this. And as the word gets out, that is going to turn away business. I mean, why would Black and South American people pay to see that? But of course, Jonathan disagrees, arguing that, quote, "Every grown-up in the room realizes that Trader Sam is not a representation of reality and is meant as a funny and silly caricature. It is no more based in racism than every Disney caricature of the out-of-touch white American dad," end quote. Well, first of all, I don't think Jonathan is in any sort of position to be talking about what the grown-ups in the room realize. After all, he's the one crying about changes to a children's theme park. Which also highlights another issue with this argument, and that's the fact that adults are not the target demographic of Disney. It's children, the very same demographic who, by Jonathan's own admission, by their omission, lack the historical awareness to assess such caricatures critically. To be clear, I'm not saying that adults like Jonathan necessarily assess them critically. If they did, they wouldn't be upset at them being removed. What I'm saying is that children, specifically white children, certainly lack that understanding. After all, they're denied any nuanced understanding through our whitewashed education system that downplays the horrors we as white people have inflicted upon the rest of the world and its people. However, this comparison is also fallacious for a couple of reasons. For one, the out-of-touch father is not a white thing. It's a trope that transgresses all ethnic groups. It's also incredibly toxic, not because of how it portrays the father, but the way it's everyone else's responsibility to work around his ignorance, though I think that's something for me to cover in a different video. The point is, you are not being singled out as a white person through that trope. Then there's the issue regarding the harm surrounding the Western narrative of headhunting and how that is used. It's not simply a notion that exists in a vacuum, it's part of a greater narrative that was created to frame entire cultures and civilizations as lesser and savage. To even compare that to the way most media coddles father figures is facile. Most writers and directors are older white men, many of whom are fathers, and so they present a narrative that teaches younger generations to always give them another chance, even when they've done absolutely nothing to earn it. And speaking of those who have power, that leads on rather nicely to the fact that racism against white people is not a thing in the US. It is impossible to be racist against a white person since racism is systemic discrimination, of which Black, brown, and indigenous people of color have always been on the receiving end of throughout US history. That's not to say a position of power is required in order for racism. After all, a black person can be racist towards East Asian people and vice versa, but it does exclude white people from the possibility. There has never been a point in US history in which the system has been stacked against white people, ever. Speaking of American history, let's move on to the changes regarding Splash Mountain. Changes that, unlike Trader Sam, were actually mentioned in the original article, albeit briefly. For you see, Splash Mountain is being updated to remove references to the mixed animated movie Song of the South, replacing them with elements taken from Disney's animated movie The Princess and the Frog. Now, Song of the South is perhaps Disney's most infamous movie. Published in 1946, The film follows the story of a wealthy white boy living on a plantation, playing with his black friends and having the wisdom of an old black man bestowed upon him. That wisdom comes in the form of various stories, taken from actual stories passed down between black slaves via oral tradition. Now, one of the key things to note here is that the film was criticised upon its original release by a sizable portion of the black community, both for reinforcing racist stereotypes and for glorifying slavery. Because in spite of Disney claiming that the film takes place after the American Civil War and thus the black characters are no longer slaves, this ignores the fact that, on top of this never being made clear anywhere in the film, slavery did not magically end overnight. Even after the 13th Amendment, many former slaves had nowhere to go. They'd all been torn away from their homes thousands of miles away, or had been born and grown up on the plantations. On top of that, there was growing resentment, both among the white working class and the wealthy aristocracy, resulting in many black communities being targeted with extreme levels of violence. So some former slaves considered it safer to remain on plantations and suffer the inhuman treatment there than risk moving to emerging black communities. The point is, there's a lot more nuance to the end of slavery than the 13th Amendment. Hell, slavery still persists in the US prison system, a system that, by the way, disproportionately targets black Americans. And that's not a coincidence, that is its design. So when the film first came out, a portion of the black community, led by groups such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, spoke out in protest of the film. It was so controversial, in fact, that it never received a home release in the US. The only times it could be seen there was its original cinema release and at one of the several re-releases. So to pretend like the problems with Song of the South are the advent of some sort of modern hypersensitivity is an ahistorical perspective. Disney simply held off changing the ride for as long as it was profitable, and they only went ahead with the changes after 5 years of discussion and market assessment. But of course, that upsets Jonathan, who bemoans the fact, stating that, quote, "If Disney screams at the top of its corporate voice, which is pretty loud, that it is changing it to appease a certain political point of view, now every time I look at the ride, I am thinking about politics," end quote. To which one has to ask, which political point of view? Because reasons aside, what they're doing is removing racism from their rides. Meaning all this is Jonathan unwittingly admitting that his Christian and conservative Republican viewpoint is inherently racist. And yet, Jonathan is still not done. We have one more example of apparent wokeism to deal with, and that's changes made to the Pirates of the Caribbean ride. Now, something that stuck out to me about Jonathan's rant here is that, unlike the Trader Sam example, Jonathan doesn't specify the changes he's referring to. And part of me can't help but wonder if this was deliberate on his part, considering the nature of said changes. Excluding changes made to the ride to tie it better to the film franchise, the only changes I could find mention of anywhere were the ones that removed depictions of rape and sexual assault from the ride. I'll say that again. Disney, the children's company, had to remove depictions of rape and sexual assault from a theme park ride, and that makes Jonathan angry. The most recent change was to the auction scene in which women, kidnapped and sold into sex slavery, were bid upon by a crowd of men. As the auctioneer attempts to sell a larger woman, the crowd cries out, "We wants the redhead," much to his frustration. Now, due to the sensitive nature of what was depicted, Disney changed the scene to depict the very same redhead, now dressed as a badass pirate, selling plundered treasure. And before people get up in arms about realism in a ride that starts with a projection of Squidward here, go read up on your pirate history. Maybe start with a case of Anne Bonny and M. Reed. Fact is, this isn't the first time said ride has had to make such updates. In 1990, scenes depicting pirates attempting to rape various women were removed, being replaced with more comical scenes such as one depicting a cook chasing a pirate after he's stolen a bunch of food. And that's really it, at least in relation to any political changes to the ride. Because apparently removing depictions of rape from a children's ride is political. Though again, none of this was done out of the goodness of the Disney Corporation's heart. I don't want to give the impression here that Disney is a well-intended friend learning from its mistakes. It is a soulless corporation. I mean, as many as 11% of their staff are recently homeless, and 68% are considered food insecure. The sole reason they made these changes was to improve their profit margins, following the very same unwavering capitalism Jonathan tells them they should return to, as if they ever stopped. Sadly, we live in a society where rape culture is so prevalent that according to the Center for Disease Control, as many as 1 in 5 women and 1 in 14 men in the US have been victim of rape or attempted rape, whilst as many as 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men have experienced sexual assault. And as much as Jonathan cries about how not seeing depictions of rape and sexual assault take him out of his Disneyland fantasy, his twisted urges don't override the well-being of the survivors of sexual violence. Victims of rape and sexual assault do not need to be slapped across the face with depictions of sexual violence at a children's theme park, any more than Black, brown, and Indigenous people of colour need to be slapped across the face with racist depictions. And if you don't understand that, then you need to isolate yourself from the rest of society. Because here is the really terrifying part. As much as the internet might like to treat Jonathan as a joke, he is the Chief Deputy District Attorney for Clark County, Nevada. He represents the US government on a local level, and his idea of a fun time is watching a Disney-style minstrel show and depictions of rape and sexual assault on a children's ride. This man has some degree of legal sway, and who can really know for sure just how his perception of Black, brown, and Indigenous people of colour, women, and the gender non-conforming impact his work. This is not some old man yells at cloud situation. This person has the potential to cause tangible harm to the lives of others. What's more is, this man felt confident enough in his views that he quite literally wrote an article in a paper flaunting his bigotry and utter disregard for victims of sexual violence. This is in spite of the fact that part of him must have known that there was a very real chance of this getting back to his colleagues and even his superiors, and yet he felt confident enough in the nature of that environment to go ahead and use his real name. That should tell you all you need to know about the US justice system. And it's important to point that out, especially since so many people believe racism, misogyny, and transphobia are strictly the realm of a few rogue elements in society, when they're not. The system is rotten to the core, and this is just a reminder of that fact. It's people like Jonathan who are working their way up the political and legal ladder, very often failing upwards, deciding whether to ease up or go all out on a case. And you can bet that his racism, sexism, and transphobia is going to feed into that. For many marginalized people, Jonathan isn't some joke. To them, he is a visual representation of the US justice system. And that's something that's not only important for us to keep in mind, but point out to others. Because as already mentioned, so many people have convinced themselves that systemic violence grounded in bigotry was so last century, that these days it's only a few bad apples. We see that rhetoric used ad nauseum in response to things like Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movements. But it's just not true. Systemic bigotry is in our courtrooms, our schools, and even our bloody theme parks. And only once we start acknowledging just how pervasive the issue really is, can we actually begin to address it. Now, if you have any questions or criticism, do post them below. Just know that abuse won't make it through. If you appreciate what we do here on the channel, do know that you can support us via Patreon. On that note, we'd just like to thank the following patrons: Matthew Kovac, Hannah Banghart, Gerrit Van Voorst, Roy and Katie, Kifuluwu, Justin Allen, Sosh Daniels, and Steve Corbin. And for myself, Udita and Levi, take care now.